Thank you very much, sir. Professor Dubey, Professor Nanda, all fellow panelists, my greetings again to all of you, and it is indeed a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I think a number of very, very important points have been made by Professor Dubey, Professor Nanda, and Professor Dhar, and I'll just build on some of those things largely in a macro context without getting into the nitty-gritty of the sectoral issues. We can get into some of those subsequently if there is a clarification and question and so on. Now, the first point that I would like to underscore is, and which has already been said, that our macroeconomic context is in a complete mess, both internally and increasingly externally. Now, if you look at the standard indicators, very standard indicators, GDP growth, as was mentioned, we have been for quite a while on a downslide. Before the pandemic, 9 quarters, as was mentioned by Biswajit, and then subsequently, things have been much worse, as we know. In any case, even that a pre-pandemic year growth rate has been revised, as you know, it is brought down from 4.2 to 4 now. If we look at far more important indicators, GDP growth is something which is not the most important indicator in my understanding and so on. What is far more important is to look at, for instance, per capita consumption, right? It is to look at what is happening to employment and so on. Now, I'll mention just these two. If we go by the NSS estimates and so on, 11, 12, and subsequently 17, 18, per capita consumption in rural India declined by 9 percentage points. Now, this is well known. But this is the context which we need to keep in very sharp view if we have to make any progress in terms of policy management and so on. This is unprecedented in independent India. This has never happened. Per capita consumption over a period of a quinquennium or more, 5-6 years, going down by that order. And it happened across deciles. Topmost decile to bottommost decile, each one of these. And this is amazing, right? If we look at unemployment, again, a great deal has been written and spoken about it. We really are talking of unprecedented crisis in terms of unemployment. Everyone knows this figure of in almost half a century or so, before the pandemic, we were already at the highest, and then subsequently, we may sort of quibble over the exact figures and so on. Yeah, what exactly is, for a variety of reasons, there is a lot of controversy there, but the fact is that pandemic could have only worsened it, and there is no escape out of that. If we look at, for instance, credit flow, almost every agency is telling you that we are in a terrible spot, and possibly the worst spot in more than half a century, 50 to 60 years. Right? If we talk of investment, over again more than a decade, and so on. So if we look at the macro indicators, very standard macro indicators, it is so evident. It should be very clear to a class 5, 7, 8 child that we are in a complete mess. Now, why is it that this recognition is not there? Why is this very elementary kind of cognition is not there? What do we see? On the contrary, this massive back thumping, massive kind of, cheering one's own performance. Now, unless we start with this very basic thing that, look, things may be bad, let's try and address these. And these are not only because of the pandemic, but a whole lot of structural issues. The context is there. And how do we deal with that? That elementary honesty is something which certainly is not part of this regime. In fact, I do not know of and cannot think of any government anywhere in the world. I mean, I'm not only talking of preceding governments in India, which has succeeded so much in disregarding the facts, manufacturing lies. It's just amazing. I mean, the scale of it, right? One particular figure regarding fiscal stimulus was mentioned earlier, right? Now, of course, by several economists who have been very critical of this 20% of GDP figure, we know, and almost every agency in the world put it between 1 and 3%. No, that has been the range. We can again quibble over what exactly should go in there and so on and so forth. But again, something so elementary and so basic, a class 10 student of economics knows that. You do not collapse the fiscal and the monetary and talk of the fiscal. It was so basic. You know, who figure continuously has been harped on, as Professor Dubey mentioned, that now they are saying almost 30%. Yeah, if you look at that, interestingly, the economic survey which was tabled, as it happens, that itself makes a correction in that and puts the figure around 2% of GDP. Now, I'm not sure whether his job is on the line, whether the finance minister has and the prime minister has looked at that figure, right? That actually the fiscal stimulus was much less than what has been talked about and so on. So this is the first point I wanted to highlight. The context being in a complete mess, endless manufacturing of lies. You know, it's like, there's as if no tomorrow in terms of kind of figuring out new ways of lying and so on. You know, we are trapped in that kind of context. So that's the first point. Yeah. On GDP, etc., whether it would be 22, 23, 24, again, there are lots of economists. Incidentally, Geeta Gopinathan, who was here, she probably is of the view, officially IMF view that possibly it would be 25, 26. By then this recovery kind of would be on track, so to say. Right? If you look at many economists outside the policy spokespersons of the government, they are saying that actually the contraction might be much higher. I mean, you have those who are thinking in terms of well above 10% in this fiscal to about 7.5%, which is the government figure and so on. So all these figures, and as it happens, given the very terrible truth that the data agencies, our statistical systems have been so massively messed up, it becomes very difficult to sort of swear by any particular number. So that's the other, Professor Dubey rightly highlighted, the challenge of assaulting institutions. And one of the biggest assaults, I don't know whether to call it biggest assault. I mean, everything has been assaulted so badly that there should be no hierarchy in terms of the degree of assault maybe in this conversation. But, it just becomes so difficult, right? Coming specifically to the budget, then, this whole claim, which was repeated by the finance minister following on the economic survey, spend. Just start looking at the numbers. What spend? Where have you spent? Right? Now, it is indeed the case that in terms of the overall revised estimate, yes, things have increased, etc. Yeah, but once we start making sense of that, For instance, something which was supposed to be a different methodology, right? And now that you account for, I'm referring to FCI, and now you say that, this is something which should be accounted for as it happens from this year, and as regards the revised estimate as well, suddenly, the numbers change. So in terms of fiscal expansion, it becomes a trickery, right? It is acknowledging a fiscal deficit, and rightly so. That limited transparency is most welcome, right? But, that essentially then tells you that it's something which is not really a real expansion anywhere, right? So this increased sort of, amount accounted for now for FCI and so on, and that is, and then consequently, various figures relating to food security and so on will come into serious question, as has been pointed out by a number of experts in the last couple of days and so on. Right? So the revised revenue, it sort of goes up to almost 34 lakh crores. Right? And likewise, the expenditure also kind of increases somewhat. But if you look at the overall revenue situation, what is the kind of downfall that we are talking about? In the year 2018-19, it was already from the budget estimate to the revised, it was already 1,90,776 crores. In the year 2019-20, it was 297,772 crores, almost 3 lakh crores. Right? This year, it's already more than 4 lakh crores and so on. Yeah. And it's only the revised estimate. We don't quite know what the final figure would be, etc. That's the kind of challenge in terms of fiscal space, which the country has to, and the policymakers have to come to terms with. That we are in a very, very difficult kind of fiscal space sort of context. And why has that happened? It has happened precisely for the reasons which were highlighted by Professor Dubey, Professor Nanda, and Professor Dhar. Right? I mean, business as usual is not going to be helping policy making. Giving concessions to the corporate sectors, fudging of figures there, etc., and allowing them to go scot-free and so on, and more of the same. Where do you get the resources then? Where will the resources come from? Right? And acknowledging this increased fiscal deficit is perfectly fine, and I think it's a good thing where sort of at least an intent has been conveyed that, look, we are not too worried about fiscal deficit. Right? That point is well taken. But the whole question of getting the resources in place, where do we get these from? Now, there, the most important point, the most important strategy seems to be something which is already massively discredited, highly controversial: sell more and more of India. Like Khelo India, it has become Cello India. I mean, this is amazing. As was pointed out by Professor Dubey, I mean, how can you sort of keep following this track, which raises so many questions? The same government, or same party, which was earlier outside the government and so on, what was its tune? What was it saying? That, look, I mean, fortunately we have Ashwani Mahajan, Dr. Mahajan, who is part of this Swadeshi Jagaran Manch. He will probably tell us more about it, that how livid this particular political formation was about selling anything. And what happens now? So that putting on the fast track further, the amount 1.75 lakh crores has already been mentioned. We know that 2018 it was Air India had been put on the block. Nothing has happened. There are lots of problems. So in any case, hoping that through this investment we will get more resources, is in any case questionable, apart from the fact that this is probably not the best strategy. Yeah, you have to be very strategic, and Professor Dubey mentioned a particular committee and how to go about it. Nothing is even acknowledged in terms of official strategy of disinvestment in that sense. Any kind of problems and what could be a better way, etc., etc. Then borrowing. Now, borrowing is the other big thing, but again, it has its challenges, etc. Right? We can get into very difficult situation, and it seems as if there is a kind of a zero recognition of the challenges associated with that. Of course, hoping that money will come. But as Professor Dhar has already mentioned, the way this money is coming and what kind of things and basically acquiring things here, etc., does that take us any further? So lots of these sort of issues. So basic point relating to the second point that I was trying to make is that in terms of a fiscal strategy, in terms of an overall budgetary strategy, resource mobilization strategy, it has been stuck in a business as usual mode. It is, if anything, moving towards something which is even more worrisome: accelerated sale of public entities and so on, market borrowings of the kind that is being talked about, and so on. Now, let me very quickly come to the so-called, the other side, the expenditure side, and so on. For lack of time, I'll just take a couple of minutes and try and highlight a few things. You see, one of the easiest thing to do in every budget as regards announcing expenditure claims is to talk of infrastructure. Nobody holds you accountable for that after. I think some 5-6 years ago, there was this talk of setting up, let's say, AIMS in Darbhanga. What happened to that? That got repeated again in the election campaign when Bihar was going through that process. Right? Lots of things which have been announced. Many of these had been announced earlier. We have had a long history of it. Late Jaswant Singh talking of 60 lakh crores spending on infrastructure, and that is when things started changing. It's basically around that time that this kind of bombastic claims of how we are spending massively on infrastructure, right? And then sort of claiming that that will revive the economy. Much of it doesn't happen. To the extent that it happens, it basically is addressed to some sort of particular segments and friends and family who are dealing with those kinds of infrastructure programs and so on. Right? So it again needs to be examined very, very carefully as regards this whole question of those areas, those sectors which could have given a decent push to demand. Each one of those has been squeezed further. Rural economy, MSMEs, we are talking of numbers, 70%, 80% have gone under the sea. Look at All India Manufacturers Organization. Mr. Raghunathan, who keeps giving you these figures almost on a daily basis, right? Two biggest components of what are we doing to them? Nothing. So any serious addressing of the demand challenge, the demand question is nowhere in the horizon. It is basically hoping that it will happen. It's good to be an optimist, but then to be an optimist, at least there should be some elementary reasons, some elementary policy interventions and so on. And very last word, I sort of mentioned that there has been some improvement in transparency in terms of, let's say, taking care of some off-budget items which were not shown earlier, and that's a good thing. But as was pointed out, if you look at the health sector and what has been said, it's complete opacity. It's giving up on that transparency. What have you done? Basically, even the Finance Commission allocations have been added in that. What kind of, I mean, can we at least expect some honesty in budget making processes? Yeah. Something which is over a period of 5 years, you suddenly add that and you do other things, you merge schemes and so on. I'm sure Professor Rama will give us lots of details and so on. But it is not confined only to the health. You read the fine print, this has happened across sectors. No accountability. Everything is fuzzy. People were claiming that, fantastic, much more transparent and so on. No. In fact, it has ended up and ended us in a context where that transparency has been seriously compromised. I think I have taken more time than I should have. My apologies, sir, Professor Dubey, for it, in case I have overshot too much. Thank you for your attention. I would love to respond to anything that participants and others may want to raise. Thank you.
Thank you very much.